Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and braving the treacherous rain. I really, really, really appreciate you being here. I'm Lynn Gross. I'm a producer here at KPCC in person. As most of you may know, KPCC and LAS host events, and just like the one tonight. And speaking of events, we have some election-related coverage events coming soon, yet to be announced. And if you want to be one of the first in the know, feel free to sign up for the newsletter, and Daphne at Check-In can help you out with that. Just another couple quick notes. We have a full program ahead, so I'm going to keep this brief. We are live streaming, so please, no audio and video recording. We have that covered. For those of you who are on social, feel free to use the hashtag welcoming the stranger. And as far as your phone, if you could please silence it and turn off your flash, I'd really appreciate it. That about covers it. Without further ado, your host, religion and diaspora reporter, Aaron Schrank.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and braving the wet Los Angeles roads to be part of this conversation tonight. My name's Aaron Schrank. I'm the religion and diaspora reporter here at the station. In this role, I try to tell stories about the intersection of religion and international affairs here in this diverse region of Southern California, a region that, as many of you know, has been a safe haven for various religious and ethnic communities facing oppression and conflict around the world. And so we're here today to talk about religion and refugee resettlement in the U.S. with some specific Southern California insights, thanks to our panelists, who I will bring out in a second. But first, I want to bring up an important chart, which is sort of the backdrop to some of our discussion today, as you can see it up here. This chart shows the annual refugee ceiling and the actual number of refugees admitted to the U.S. since 1980, when the U.S. Refugee Act was passed and the modern refugee resettlement was formed, resettlement program was formed. As you can see, it's moved around a lot, but it's definitely been on a downward trend in recent years under the current administration. In October, the Trump administration decided to cut the annual refugee cap to 18,000 people, which is a historic low, as you can see, the lowest ceiling that we've had in decades. For some context, in 2016, the program admitted about 85,000 refugees. But tonight's discussion is about more than just the political debate over the refugee ceiling. Our goals for the night are to look at the current U.S. Refugee resettlement policy and its impact on refugees and the agencies that serve them. Also to discuss the historic role of faith-based groups in refugee resettlement in this country, and to examine what some of the major faith traditions and sacred texts are interpreted to say about refugees, and how Scripture is perhaps used on either side of the debate. So we'll be focused on the Abrahamic faiths based on who's on our panel today. But if your particular faith tradition or interpretation is not represented today and you feel like you have something to add, please feel free to weigh in and talk to us during the Q&A period, which will happen at the end here. But first, let me introduce our panelists one by one. First, Ava Steffens. She will come out here now, and she's the California Director of Strategic Engagement for World Relief. It's a Christian humanitarian group that until recently was resettling refugees in Orange County. She previously served as the CEO of Christian Community Development Association. She practiced immigration law in Orange County, and her family came to the U.S. as refugees from Cuba. Please welcome Ava. Next up, Neil Comis-Daniels. He's the rabbi and spiritual leader at Beth Sher Shalom Synagogue, the Progressive Reform Synagogue in Santa Monica. He's a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He serves on the advisory board of the interfaith organization, the Giebert Center, and works closely with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, here in Los Angeles. Please welcome Rabbi Neil. Next up, we have Nala Kayali. She's the founder and executive director of Access California Services down in Anaheim. It's a health and human services organization serving refugees and immigrants for 20 years with a focus on Arab American and Muslim American communities. She came to the U.S. as a Palestinian refugee from Syria in the 70s. She's the chairperson of the Orange County Refugee Forum and a member of the California State Advisory Council on Refugee Assistance and Services. Please welcome Nala. Last but not least, we have Scott Ray. He's a professor of Christian ethics and the dean of faculty at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. That's a Christian university in La Mirada. He's written several books on ethics and is the former president of the Evangelical Theological Society and a senior fellow for the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. Before starting at Talbot 30 years ago, Scott was a pastor at Mariners Church in Irvine. Please welcome Scott. Great. Well, thank you guys all so much for being here to be part of this discussion. I want to start with some questions for the service providers or folks with some of that experience about the current policy landscape. I've heard many refugee advocates say that the program is currently under attack and that the U.S. is kind of abandoning its historic leadership role when it comes to providing hospitality to refugees. And obviously there's a lot going on in refugee policy right now. There's the refugee ceiling, as you saw earlier, which is its lowest in decades. The Trump administration has also recently placed moratoriums on refugee resettlements, which in October resulted in 0 refugees being resettled in the U.S., literally 0. Also, the administration has recently issued an executive order that would allow state and local officials to say no to refugee resettlement in their states and cities. Those are just to name a few things on the policy landscape right now that are in some of our minds. For those who work in the refugee resettlement space, I guess I'll start with you, Ava. I guess what would you say, in your role at World Relief, what's been the biggest challenge in recent years? I guess put things in perspective for us in terms of what's changed.
Well, when you think about the fact that there's approximately 26 million people around the world seeking refuge because of conditions in their home country are untenable, and so that really and the number keeps coming down. In 2016, the ceiling for refugees was at 110,000. So we could have brought in up to 110,000 refugees if we would have hit that ceiling. But in actuality, it was closer to 95,000, and now the new ceiling is 18,000. And as you said, no refugees at all in October of this year. There are a lot of people that are hurting all over the world that, and the U.S. has always been known as a country that welcomes those that are vulnerable and that need refuge. So what it's doing, well, practically speaking, to World Relief, what it's done is we've had to close several offices, of course, and so that means that people that would have been receiving benefits or help to integrate into American society are no longer receiving that help. So we've gone from 25 offices to 18 offices across the country, and then of course there were about a quarter of our staff in the U.S. that was reduced. So in that way, it also affected, very practically speaking, World Relief and the communities where World Relief is serving.
Sure. And then, Nalo, do you want to add to that? What have you seen at Access California Services in terms of looking at this number, fewer refugees coming into the country? What does that look like on the ground here in Southern California, or at least in Anaheim at your operation?
Well, we've been serving refugees for many, many years, and the decrease in the refugee resettlement now, it did create a lot of fears in the community and a significant decrease in funding. Some of the program was eliminated 100%. We had to lay off staff who they were with us for many, many years, and amazing staff that we had to eliminate. But it is heartbreaking because refugees, they're still here and they need a lot of support. Refugees who are under 5 years, they're still refugees, but there's not enough resources for them.
Certainly. Well, I mean, since we're talking about refugee policy, obviously this is part of a larger conversation about immigration policy, but I think maybe important, I don't know which one of you wants to take a crack at this, but I wonder if somebody could explain the difference between refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, and perhaps why it's important to understand those distinctions in this conversation. Nala, do you want to take that one?
Well, there's a huge difference between immigrants and refugees. Immigrants, they come to our country by choice, whether through family members, immigration, outstanding visa. They come with money for education. Immigrants, they come by choice. Refugees, they come by force because they had to flee their own countries, and they go to the neighboring countries and they apply for refugee status. And according to UNHCR, they distribute them according to the United Nations members countries, and usually United States, they take majority of the refugees of the world.
Sure. I want to, I guess, maybe sticking with Nala for a second, I want to ask, your organization serves Muslim Americans in particular, but I think serves all sorts of folks. But I wanted to ask you how Muslim refugees in particular have been treated in recent years, obviously under the Muslim ban and other policies. And I'm especially interested in Syria, given the large number of refugees there. Since the civil war began in 2011, more than 6 million people displaced outside of the country, I think even 6 million more internally. I guess, what can you tell us about what's happened in terms of Syrian refugees in Southern California and how that trajectory has changed in over the last 8 years?
Well, refugees are treated equally among all the resettlement agency and the service providers. The Muslim ban, the ban is concentrated on Muslim countries, which that's why they call it the Muslim ban. All countries from the Muslim world that they were affected. And we have a lot of refugees from those countries who they have families in the pipelines who are coming. So there was, they created a lot of fears and anxiety, and some of them, they cannot really cope with the mental things here by looking for a job and finding the proper job. And it did affect the Syrian refugees, but the community and the faith-based organizations, all of us came together and we continued the support, although we did not receive support from the government, but the community really came together from every faith that to help the refugees. And we're very proud of all of us came together to help humanity.
Sure. Rabbi Neal, I want to ask, I mentioned the idea that many refugee advocates say that the system, it seems to be under attack, and I guess from the current administration, but I guess from a policy perspective, but then also quite literally the tradition of resettling refugees was sort of attacked when you look at the attack on Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue, which claimed 11 lives, which was at least partially motivated by the shooter's feelings about the Jewish community's welcoming of refugees. The shooter had been posting online about the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, bringing in, quote, invaders. And I guess I just want to know what you think we should make of that as we have this discussion tonight, that fact.
Well, first of all, it's a very sad reality that that kind of perspective and rhetoric has been allowed to be free in our country, and it hit home very much for me in our congregation because, like many congregations in the country, we too celebrated a HIAS Sabbath, a HIAS Shabbat that week, and people thought we could have been just as vulnerable. And I sermonized about the young man who was the nurse, actually, who took care of the shooter when he came to the hospital, and he turned out to be the son of a colleague of mine, and he, as a nurse, said, my responsibility, not only as a nurse, but as an American and as a Jew, is to be kind to this person and heal this person. But he's still suffering from PTSD to this day, and it's frightening for us as a Jewish community that this that anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head again. But as a professor of mine once said, it's never going to go away in Western society. It will just ebb and flow. And so this, unfortunately, is a time when it's flowing. and it's very, very frightening.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess sticking with you, I want to dig in a little bit into the kind of history of faith-based advocacy in refugee resettlement. We mentioned HIAS, which is one of the 9 organizations that works with the federal government to actually do the resettlement work, to actually resettle refugees nationwide. Of those 9 organizations, 6 of them are faith-based, including HIAS, which was founded back in 1881. Right. Also, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, founded back in 1939. U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, also involved there. For decades, countless more faith-based groups have, supported refugees and asylum seekers in finding housing and jobs. I guess maybe starting with you, Rabbi Neal, since you are somewhat involved in HIAS, what can you tell us about how HIAS and other groups like it, I guess particularly those within the Jewish community, how they began? Help us understand how it came to be that faith-based groups play such a large role in this space.
Well, I think first of all, we need to look at the reality. Look at the reality of what's coming in the Christian calendar. Coming up is the story of God being born in human form as a refugee, as needing a place to go. So in many of our traditions, Muhammad was pushed around from place to place and so on and so forth, and also seeking refuge. So the idea is that in our mythical stories, we have a refugee component. We have a refugee element that we lean on and we go back to, and in a sense, morally and ethically, as a result of that, the lens we put on to see the world is as former refugees who are now stable, who have taken that not as just a badge of history, but rather as an obligation to realize that somewhere, somehow in our past, we were pushed around from place to place. And now, if we're more settled, we need to take on the responsibility of helping those who are not.
Sure. Ava, could you speak at all to kind of, I guess, the origins of World Relief a little bit?
Yes, World Relief was started 75 years ago, and the way it was started was to serve war-torn populations in Europe. So that was the origin of World Relief, and since then, its mission is to empower local churches to serve the most vulnerable around the world. And since the refugee resettlement program started in the U.S. in 1980, been serving refugees within the U.S. as well. So, sure. Yeah, and that's, as you said, it's such a part of the Christian faith. As we read through all our scriptures, we are a story of journey. Our faith story is a story of journey throughout the world. So,
sure, certainly. And something else I wanted to mention was that obviously some percentage of refugees and also, I guess, asylum seekers are leaving, are fleeing because of, in some cases, religion or religious identity in some way or another. I guess the question is, how often does religion and religious identity play a role in refugees becoming refugees, historically and today? And I'll stick with Ava, and then I'll go over to Scott.
We currently, about 45% of refugees are actually Christians, and about a third, I believe, are Muslims. So that's where we are currently in terms of refugee populations. Yeah.
Sure. Anything to add, Scott?
Yeah, I think for the most part, refugees and immigrants coming from Latin America into the United States, I think, is less so because of religious reasons, more for economic reasons. But I think particularly the experience in Europe has been that immigrants who are coming from North Africa and from the Middle East, that I think maybe reflect an even higher percentage coming for religious reasons. The reason I say that, my wife works for Open Doors, which is a nonprofit that works with the persecuted Christians around the world, and a lot of the focus of their activity in recent years has shifted from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc into the Middle East and parts of Asia today, and so the number of people that they're in contact with, is legion, who have been displaced almost exclusively for religious reasons. So it's a pretty significant, I think, part of the refugee population, depending on the region that they're coming from.
Certainly. And I want to ask you, Scott, what would you say, what's the outspoken attitude of most religious groups today on the refugee issue in terms of public advocacy? And I guess we have some sense of that. So I guess really the question is, why do you think we don't see more public advocacy in favor of restrictive immigration policy from faith-based groups?
Well, I think you may not be aware of some of the faith-based groups that are out there that are advocating for that, because they are definitely out there, and they've become more prominent, I think, in probably the last 5-6 years. I think part of the reason for that is that we have to recognize that the experience of the majority culture into which refugees and immigrants come is really different in the U.S. than it is in Europe. And Europe, I think, has had a much more, I think the best way to put it would be a much more dislocating experience with immigration that we've had in the United States so far. I mean, they've been overwhelmed now, and many of those countries have essentially opened their borders to some of the Syrian refugees, for example. So I think that some of the concern among religious groups, particularly based on the experience in Europe, is that we have to balance compassion, and we'll talk about that too. We have to balance the need for compassion, the mandate to take care of the vulnerable among us, which I would agree is on virtually every page of the Bible. But how that translates into public policy is not always a straight line. And so the connection between the moral mandates of the Bible and what public policy prescriptions are that's a tricky and challenging area to talk about, and I don't think we can assume that there's just a straight line correspondence between those two.
Sure, yeah. Let's talk more about sacred texts and scripture. There are certain religious texts that come up in these conversations, more than others. In the Hebrew Bible, it says, "You shall love them as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." The commandment, "Love the stranger, welcome the stranger," appears, Rabbi Neil, you said 36 times in the Torah?
36 times, yeah.
More than any other commandment, is that?
Exactly.
Is that right? In the New Testament, Matthew 25, you've got, Matthew 25, I think it's 35, Matthew 25 verses 35. "For I was hungry when you gave me For I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty and you gave me drink, a stranger and you welcomed me." Similarly, Islamic law establishes an obligation to provide protection and assistance to persons in need, including migrants. In the Quran, it says, "He who gives respite to someone who is in straitened circumstances or grants him remission, Allah will shelter him in the shade of his throne on the day of resurrection." So there's, those are some of the popular examples that folks have probably heard. I'm going to ask each of you this. What scripture do you look to, or what is it in your faith tradition that motivates you in terms of this issue? When you're trying to, I guess, settle on a moral response, or what you might consider a godly response to this particular issue for you personally, or, if you want to be more prescriptive for civic leaders, where do you turn in your scripture, in your faith tradition? We'll just go down the line. I'll start with Ava.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Matthew 25, and definitely Matthew 25, 31 to 46 speaks to me personally, but it also speaks to how Jesus in the last day will take people and divide them to the left and to the right. And he says the goats to the left and the sheep to the right. And as you said, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So that to me is when I look at what we're facing into like the last day, like the judgment day, if that's not really what motivates me. What motivates me is my love of God and of people. But I mean, that to me is just such a clear command and mandate for how we are to live our lives today, if our lives are going to count for anything when we come to Judgment Day. So I think it's also for people in general, not just for me personally.
Sure. Rabbi Neil?
Well, I'd sort of like to pick up on what Nava said about mandate, that, from a Jewish point of view, it's not just about story, it's not just about myth, it's about mandate. I would say that I would think that it is our responsibility to draw a straight line from our morality, directly to what we think policy should be. Let our elected officials under our pressure actually try to figure out what the balance might be. But my role is to be morally idealistic. My role is to say that that not only is it part of my heritage that I'm a refugee who's now free, but it's also just a mandate, a commandment. That's what we call them. We call them mitzvot, which are not good deeds. Mitzvot are commandments. These are things that we have to get done. There's work to do in the world, and this is part of it.
Sure. Now, you practice Islam. What is it in your scripture, in your faith tradition, that you're most drawn to?
Well, I'm a proud Muslim, and I was raised and according to the Quran and my religion, what it's asking me to do for humanity. In our religion, we have a right for every human being to have a house over his head, get a clothes to cover his naked, needs water and food. And that, I think we all agree on this with each religion. So, and serving humanity and serving our neighbors, serving the people in need, and we get the good deed that we, after this life, when the day of judgment, whoever helped the needy will be getting, closer to God, and will God take care of him at the end. It is in our heart that we have to help every human being, not even the Muslim community, every human being, because every human being deserves to live in dignified life.
Sure. And Scott, for you as a Christian, any particular teaching or piece of scripture you think important to draw our attention to?
Well, I think, sort of all of the above here first, but to add to what Ava has said, I think throughout biblical history, the people of God have almost always been a people on the move. Rabbi, you pointed that out. Except for a period where the children of Israel were settled in the land, which is the exception to the general rule. The people of God, even in the New Testament era, the early church, it didn't take long for them, though they wanted to be settled in one place, before they were scattered out throughout the known world to proclaim the good news of Jesus. I would add to it, though, sort of more fundamentally, the notion that I think we would all agree on, that every human being is created in the image of God, and therefore has intrinsic dignity regardless of their race, ethnicity, disability, ability to function, where they come from, what their immigration status is. They all have intrinsic dignity and deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. I think that's. I'm repeating what everybody else says, but those, I think the idea that you can actually read the Bible seriously and not take into account the numerous mandates. And I think the word mandate is right. Mandates to care for the poor, the needy, the vulnerable, of which refugees and immigrants are a part. It's not the whole, but they're a pretty significant part. In fact, I tell my grad students that having a callous heart for the poor and the marginalized is inconsistent with faithfully following Christ. And cultivating that heart for the poor and marginalized is a constituent element of faithfully following Christ.
Sure. Scott, I want to ask you about another Bible passage that comes up in these sorts of conversations fairly often. I guess Romans 13, it's chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. I think that's actually just 13 verses 1. This is a commonly invoked verse, as you know, perhaps most famously recently last summer, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions cited this passage in defense of the Trump administration's policy of separating immigrant children at the border from their families at the border. I guess really the question is, what do you think about this passage and its place in the current debate?
Well, I think that Jeff Sessions' use of that exposes the danger of there being an automatic straight line between moral mandates and public policy. Because I would say Romans 13 is a place to start, but it's not the end, nor is it the trump card. No pun intended.
Or maybe intended.
But it's not. It's certainly an element in the discussion. But even the New Testament apostles did not consider that an absolute. Because twice, in both glaring instances in the book of Acts, where they were being silenced for proclaiming the gospel, they made it very clear that when the law of God conflicts with the law of the land, that we have a higher obligation to obey the law. We must obey God and not men. And so I think that I think is a pretty clear suggestion that though Romans 13, I think God ordained civil government for good reasons, but it's not an absolute, and the reason for that is because civil government is often run by, or is always run by fallible, flawed, broken people who are in positions of power, and so there's always the option for civil disobedience. And I think that's a legitimate biblical option.
Right, yeah, something to add, Rabbi Neal?
I just think it's important to note that Paul goes on in Romans 13 to say that the greatest notion that we have as religious people is to love our neighbors as ourselves. So that's right there, and it's in couplet almost. And I think it's important to note that he's saying that, and in that he is echoing Rabbi Akiva, who lived well before him, who said, "Ze klal gadol b'Torah." This is a great generality in the Torah, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And so I think ultimately what Paul was saying is, if to obey the law without love is not obeying the law at all, right? Or if the law is constituted without love for everyone as themselves, then it's not law at all.
Certainly. I want to ask, we obviously mentioned many of the scriptures that are commonly quoted in these discussions, and for good reason, about welcoming the stranger, helping the other, doing unto others, that sort of thing. I wonder, and I kind of am genuinely curious, if because I'm not a religious scholar, are there any counterexamples? I guess aside from the way that Romans 13 is used, are there any particular counterexamples that are worth mentioning from Scripture that can be interpreted or are interpreted to support ideas like stricter immigration, national sovereignty, these sorts of ideas? I guess Rabbi Neal.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have that within the larger sense of Jewish writing and Jewish legal commentary, the right to establish borders and defend your borders and so on and so forth. And I would agree that that even though we have a statement in the Talmud that says, very, very similar to Romans 13, that says dina de malchut adina, that the law of the land is the law, it is the law of the land, but the law of the heart is always there and needs to, maybe I'll make the pun intended, it needs to trump anything that comes down harshly on another human being who is made in and incorporates the same image.
Sure. Scott Ray, anything to add there in terms of? I mean, obviously you've communicated that you agree that the essence of at least the Bible is these sorts of messages. But are there any counterexamples that are worth noting?
Well, some of the ones that are pointed out sometimes are just the emphasis on, say in the Proverbs, for example, on personal responsibility, the idea that the help and aid for the vulnerable. It was never intended in the Scripture to be a permanent thing unless you were, unless you were without the ability to support yourself. It was a means to help people get on their feet so that they could end up supporting themselves. The idea, as Paul puts it in Thessalonians, if you don't work, you don't eat, which means that's not a statement of fact. That's a prescription for the community. That if you are able to work and don't, then you're not entitled to a share in the community's goods for those who are unable to work. I mean, to be sure, throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, there's a significant safety net for those who are either through age or through disability or through mental illness, unable to work. But the Bible is pretty clear about I would call it a mandate to pursue your self-interest sufficient to take care of your own needs and those of your dependents. Sometimes I think those are taken out of their context and used to minimize the obligation that we have to be of aid to those who are on the margins.
Sure. We've talked somewhat broadly about how what different faith traditions perhaps are interpreted to say about refugees, but just getting in briefly into how everyday people feel about this issue. Just want to mention, looking at some Pew data, by the way, about I guess nearly 80% of Americans identify with a faith group. By the way, but generally Americans are somewhat divided over whether the U.S. should accept refugees. Last year, Pew did a survey in which 51% of people said that the U.S. had a responsibility to accept refugees into the country, whereas 43% said it doesn't. And so I guess my question is, and I'm going to I'll go back to Scott with this. I guess basically the idea that no nation, no government can truly offer unlimited hospitality to all persons at all times. And so how do we, if you're somebody who's trying to approach this scripturally, so to speak, how do you deal with that? I guess for you, is what Jesus commands of his followers really what is commanded to be the ethics of the state? And how do you strike that balance?
Well, I think in a short answer, I'd say not necessarily. And there's a lot to that. In fact, I think for those of us that take our sacred text seriously, which all of us in this panel do, I think this is the most complicated question that you've asked the whole night, because the connection between what our sacred texts teach and what public policy in a pluralistic culture ought to be, I think, is a really challenging idea. One is, the first part of this, I think we need to recognize that there are enormous differences between what the average person experienced in biblical times and what the context for people on the move is today. In biblical times, borders were not nearly what they are today. I mean, most borders were set by natural resources. I mean, or they were set by boundary stones. And there were serious penalties, in fact, in the Mosaic Law for moving boundary stones, because that constituted theft of property, essentially. But I think the other part of this, I think there weren't nations in biblical times in the same way that we have national entities today with really strict borders. I mean, in large part, throughout most of the Hebrew Bible, the nations were mostly clans or fairly extended families that themselves were fairly nomadic, and so they were always on the move in that regard. I think I would not advocate anything like a theocracy where the law of God is sort of automatically the law of the land. And I'm not sure. I just in response to your comment about there ought to be a straight line. I don't think for any of us there's an automatic and necessary straight line between what our sacred texts teach and what public policy ought to be. For example, I don't know anybody, and I suspect none of us on this panel, would favor criminalizing adultery. I mean, even though I think cheating on your spouse is horribly immoral, I would never suggest that there ought to be the same sort of penalties, not to mention the penalties that the Mosaic Law prescribed for adultery. I take very seriously, for a second example, Jesus' mandate to be forgiving. But I would certainly not want to argue that the state is in the business of forgiveness. In fact, our whole criminal justice system sort of goes out the window if that's true. And I recognize that on one day at the end of every presidential term, the state is in the business of forgiveness when pardons are issued in mass. But other than that, I think I would say that the moral mandate for me as an individual is not necessarily the same thing as what public policy ought to be. And I think you're right, Rabbi, in what you say. The moral mandate for us as a religious community and as individuals who are faithfully following our tradition is to care deeply and to put shoe leather on that for the most vulnerable among us. But when it comes to what public policy ought to be, that's invariably the arena of negotiation and limited objectives. And I think what the Bible gives us in terms of public policy are what the ideals ought to be. I think you're right about that. What the principles are and what the ends of a public policy ought to be. But I think there's a lot of room for debate over what the most effective means ought to be for achieving those ends. I suspect we would all agree on what the ends are. But how we navigate the different interests that come into play, particularly when it comes to refugees and immigration. The interest of immigrants and refugees are not the only ones that are being considered when it comes to public policy. So I think it's just formulating public policy on this is a little bit messier, and I think no public policy is going to be perfect. But I do think that we can actually make significant progress in terms of public policy. I think we'd all agree here that the system has some major holes in it, if not being downright broken. But when it comes to our religious traditions informing the details of policy prescriptions, as I read the Bible, it doesn't give us detailed sets of what public policy ought to be. It gives us broader general principles, values, and ideals.
Sure. Anybody else want to hop in on this in particular? Nala?
Well, actually, for our country here, United States, we earned the superpower. And by earning the superpower in the world, we're obligated for the safety of the people around the world. And we are the richest country on earth. So we can be able to handle a lot of refugees. We can handle over 100,000 every year. Easy. And we need to remember we're all refugees to this earth. When Adam and Eve came down, they were refugees from heaven to the earth. And God did not give them specific area to live. He gave them the whole earth to live in. Borders are human-made. Government made those borders. But we should have the freedom of where we need to live and where to raise our families. When refugees were left Mecca in Saudi Arabia and they went to Medina, they took them with open arms and they did treat them better than their own families. That during, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so we all need to help each other and take care of the needy. And this earth belongs to all of us. We were born equal and we will die equal, and we need to take care of each other.
Scott?
Can I just ask you a question
Yes.
on that? So as you think about translating that into some sort of public policy, would you be an advocate then of open borders around the world?
I would.
You would?
I would. Personally, I would.
Okay.
Yes.
Rabbi
because
Neal.
I have the choice to live whether I live in California or live in New York, where I can be able to make a better living for me and my family. But I think if we put our differences aside, we can all live together safely.
Rabbi Neal, any wisdom to add about how you approach kind of maybe that balance between?
Well, adding wisdom is a tall order, but I would say this, that The Hebrew name of the Jewish people is Ivrim, right? That we are passers through or passers over. And Abraham, or Avram as he was at the beginning, never lost that identity. He was called Avram HaIvri, right? The one who kind of passes over, not quite never quite touches the ground. And I take that sort of personally when it comes to my grandparents or my great-grandparents, who I think would never be able to pass the litmus test today of being a refugee, because they couldn't point to saying, well, there's going to be a pogrom next Thursday, in my town and they're going to try and kill me, because nobody knew when that was happening. And in their day, no one could have predicted that anti-Semitism would be mechanized. And used in such a way that it would become genocide. So the reality is that we have to, if we're looking at our moral mandates from our various traditions, whether or not we have open borders is, but that I think it's a great ideal, and I share it. And we have to have a wider net, because the people who are coming to our borders. I mean, nobody makes a trek from Guatemala to the border of the United States. They don't do that for fun. That's not just let's take a family hike. And Avram didn't do that either. When his family left Ur, and he didn't even start the journey; he picked up the journey. So the reality is that these are people who are in desperate need, and far be it from us to nitpick about what they're desperate about. If someone had done that with my family, I wouldn't be sitting here, and I think the same is true for many of us.
Sure.
Can I also chime in?
Please.
So, as Christians, we believe that we're citizens of God's kingdom of heaven. Mm-hmm. So what we have here on earth is actually on loan to us. So personally, to me, the tricky line is the line from my faith to public policy. Whether or not the government has the right to establish reasonable limits, I have to leave to people that have the nerve and courage to run for office and take on that role. But as an individual, I honestly believe that I have when we hear the story of the Good Samaritan and the person says to Jesus, he tries to kind of weasel his way out of it by saying, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus actually flips the narrative on him and tells the story of the Good Samaritan, who was, of course, someone that was looked down upon in those days. So as a Christian person, I believe that my duty is to love my neighbor, not to ask, where are you from? What are your credentials? Are you here legally or not? That's not my job to do. So, and it's also my duty, I believe personally, that it's my duty to advocate for generosity and welcoming spirit from our government and to our government elected officials, because it is that's what this country was founded on to begin with. People that were fleeing persecution came to this country and started and developed a democracy. And so that democracy actually invites us to participate in the system and to speak into it. So as an individual, that's what I believe my duty is. So anyway,
sure.
As a Christian. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, certainly. I guess I want to move on. I think one last question for now before switching to the Q&A, since you've all been waiting so patiently. I guess I want to ask, and I'll ask this to Ava. I wonder what you think. obviously, you're with World Relief, which, I guess everybody here speaks in religious language about the refugee issue. I wonder, especially at a time when the refugee system is, the very tradition of welcoming refugees seems to at least, we use the phrase under attack, but it's at least changing. I wonder, I guess the question is, do you think it behooves the resettlement agencies and the resettlement system to root the advocacy in religious language? I guess, and if so, why? I guess, might the cause be better served if the moral argument were made on secular terms? And I kind of ask as a devil's advocate.
Well, I actually think that there are some good arguments that aren't religious-based
Sure.
for immigration, such as the economy. Our economy does better because of immigrants, not worse. I do have the numbers written here because I knew I was going to forget, but refugees, between 2005 and 2014, refugees paid $63 billion more in taxes than the total cost of benefits they received. That's an economic argument right there for refugees. And then cultural. Nobel Prize awardees, 31% of U.S.-based awards are to those born outside of the U.S. There's a lot of other great arguments other than our religion. As people of faith, I think that all of us live our lives based, first of all, on that faith, but there are other excellent secular arguments for the benefits of refugees in our country.
Sure. Rabbi Neal, anything to add there?
Well, obviously, something we were talking about in the green room is that, I know that, for my people and for, many other peoples who've been here, who've come here, we've never had it so good. And not only recently in terms of the give back to the national economy and the national culture and the national prowess and making us a superpower, but that has been fueled by refugees since the founding of this country. It may not have been captured in statistics at the beginning because no one really focused on that. But the reality is that this is, in the proudest and best sense, a nation of immigrants. We need to maintain that as an example to the world because nobody does it like this. Nobody has done it like this, and reducing the cap on immigration is antithetical to what this nation is supposed to be.
Sure. And actually, I want to add one more question for you, Rabbi. I guess I wanted you to speak to why or how you think it is that members of adherents of the same faith, even members of the same church or synagogue, could arrive at very different positions on this issue. And I ask this to you in particular because Stephen Miller went to your synagogue as a child. He's, of course, the policy advisor responsible for much of the most kind of hardline immigration policy. And so, any thoughts there as to
Well, Stephen Miller obviously didn't pick up my message.
Right.
Obviously, in America, people have a right to do that. But I also have here we are in Pasadena, where when Japanese Americans were put into internment camps, there was a one religious voice that rang out in America from All Saints Church right here in Pasadena to say it was absolutely immoral and an abomination to do that. I do think that the intersect is tricky, there's an old tradition in Judaism that you turn it over and over and you can always find something new in it. So people will have different opinions, it's very traditional within Judaism to argue with each other and to argue with God even. But there's also a tradition that once the law is put into the hands of human beings, that it's ours now. And we have to, you know, these are the hands of God, and this is the mouth of God, and these are the eyes of God, and this is the heart of God in this world. And if we operate like that in this world, if we take on that responsibility and realize that we're all joined in that effort, that there's nothing really that separates us, then I think we'll come out with the good and the just answer. Look, even the rabbis said, well, God can't have just one throne, because God must sit on sometimes the throne of justice and sometimes the throne of mercy. But we have to be the ones that can sit in the one in the middle.
Sure, certainly. I want to open things up now for some audience questions. And so my colleague Daphne will be walking around with a microphone. But I guess if you've got a question that you'd like to ask of one of the panelists, please raise your hand and she will come to you. I know many of you probably have comments you'd like to make too. Maybe save those till afterwards. Hopefully try to ask something that ends in a question mark, if you know what I mean. And then I'll try to convince these guys to stick around at the end if people have longer discussions that they want to have.
My question is for the professor. As we know, a large base for the current president would be evangelical Christians who probably have the same scriptures as, you know, the liberal Christians have. In your experience, what was the most effective argument, or what was the thing that would do a paradigm shift of looking at refugees and asylum seekers differently, from being hostile to showing mercy, since it's all the matter of interpretation? But what have you found to be the most effective argument?
That's a really insightful question. Thank you. I think I wouldn't say it's one particular text or passage of Scripture, but I think it's the cumulative effect of the Bible's teaching on our obligation to care for the most vulnerable among us. And I think to see, it runs on virtually every page of the Bible. And that's why the way I put it to my students is to say it is a constituent element of being faithful to what God's calling you to do. Regardless of what you do for a living, you are obligated to cultivate that. And I think, so I would say, what I ask my students to do an exercise and to say, if you took your Bible and cut out every place in the Bible that talked about serving the poor and the vulnerable among us, to see what kind of Bible you would actually have left. And so, hopefully they don't actually do that for real. But I think it's that I think is the most powerful part of this. We did a thing, I led a thing in my church a few years ago when I was on a pastoral staff, where we spent a full year just reading the Bible about our obligation to the poor and marginalized among us. And we came up with literally hundreds and hundreds of texts that spoke to this, and we all had it had the same impact on all of us, and it was that the cumulative effect nearly knocked us over. So that in my experience has been the most helpful thing, as opposed to there being one, or more specific text. I trust that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much for your insights so far. My question's on Europe. Do any of you have insight into, I guess, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-refugee sentiment, how it compares to the U.S., what it looks like compared to the U.S. going forward in the coming years, and that in light of the rise in nationalistic political parties?
I'll speak to it too after you're done.
Well, many countries in Europe, they're much smaller than United States, and they took much larger numbers of refugees. And they're smart. Refugees, they bring a lot of assets to any countries, and they add to the economic, they add to the education, they add to the society. So maybe, just like my friend said, they did pay a lot of taxes. Refugees, I serve, I'm the chairperson for the Refugee Forum in Orange County. And since we got the contract, none of the refugees become homeless. They were homeless before, and they don't want to make it again. So Europe and the small countries, they took much more than United States, where we can accept much more. And our countries here, in the past, they want the best of the best. That's why the borders were open to refugees and immigrants. And that's why we become the superpower. We all came from different countries. This land used to belong to the Indian. And we all came from different parts of the world. And look how great we are here. It is the land of opportunity, and we all been successful here. Most of us are successful, and we did make it. And we worked hard and smart to make it here in the land of opportunity. And I think Europe been really smarter at this time by taking a lot of refugees from different parts of the world.
Yeah, I think on the economic part, I agree. And I think part of it, to your point about how we see immigrants in terms of economics, I think that the Bible, I think, fundamentally sees human beings as producers, more than consumers or as drains. And I think particularly in the right economic system that allows people the opportunity to sort of maximize their own gifts and skills and talents. I think it's more accurate to see immigrants and refugees in the right economic system as net producers rather than net drains on the economy. And I think that I don't think that's largely the way immigrants and refugees are seen in terms of we tend to see them more in terms of the drain and not what they contribute and what they produce. I do think, to get to your question, I do think the experience of the host countries in Europe is actually somewhat different than the experience of the United States as the majority culture country receiving immigrants and refugees here. And I think, there are several reasons for this, but I think one of them is that I think for the most part, immigrants who are coming to the United States from Latin America come largely from a Roman Catholic background where I think that there's a very similar worldview that I think is consistent with a lot of our democratic traditions that are already in place. And that's why I think it's less challenging, I think, for immigrants coming from Latin America, for example, to integrate into the majority culture than it would be in some other parts of the world. I think there are some of the immigrants, what we've heard coming out of Europe is that some, not all, but some of the immigrants who are coming from North Africa, from the Middle East, and other parts of the world come with a worldview that may not be quite as compatible with some of those democratic traditions as we're seeing with a large part of the migration into the United States. And so I think there is some of that. I think where you see this is how you see some of the European countries being concerned about how refugees and immigrants are, how can I put this, how they are sort of reshaping the landscape of the national identity of the particular country that they're coming to. And I think the degree to which people from different parts of the world desire to integrate into the countries into which they come, I think varies widely. And I think that has something to do with that. I wouldn't want the experience that we've had in the U.S. to necessarily be universalized, because I do think the experience in Europe is actually quite different than ours. Hope that's a start at answering your question.
Good evening. I am led a career in public service, and I've taken the step to run for Congress now. And faith has guided me every step of the way. And as I heard tonight about the difference between the law of the land and the law of the heart. And so I wanted to know if you can give any advice for, legislators to, make that bridge between the two and to affect change in the nation and the world.
Well, I use that phrase. I've actually never used it before, so now I have to kind of back it up. But it's something I've really believed for a long time, and I think it goes to the last question as well. I mean, I think that one of the differences in the reception to immigrants coming from various places, one of the differences between here and other countries is that the founders of this country made a real paradigm shift. And we had a great lesson in constitutional law today, if you were listening at all to what was going on. And I'm sure as a future elected official you did. The way that they worked things was an incredible weaving together of a strong value system that was expressed in secular law. With the ability to tweak that system. I mean, it reminds me very much of a Talmudic discussion that well, actually, first there's an old joke in my tradition that there's a rabbi adjudicating a case in his home, and he listens to one side and he says, I think you might be right. And then he listens to the other side and he says, I think you might be right too. And his wife calls from another room and says, they both can't be right. He said, you're right too. So, I mean, and I think that really is, if you've ever looked at a Supreme Court decision, a Supreme Court decision is written in a way that values the minority opinion as much as the majority opinion. The reason is because you don't have a majority opinion without that minority opinion. It won't stand. And so I think that ultimately what the founders of this country did was they made sure that heart was always there. And when that heart spoke to them, and said that, we can't treat African Americans like part of a person anymore. Right? We can't not treat women as full human beings. We can't not allow people to marry out of love whoever they're in love with. That's not what the core of this country is about. And it's not sort of this very automatic sort of Pavlovian, response, this automatic response to the stranger, right? And the kind of the response that we have as humans, and our hormones start driving us to protect ourselves and protect our families and so on and so forth. They forced us to have a more open vision and a more open possibility for this country. And I think I'm proud and grateful to be here because of that.
So we've talked a bit about the link between religion and policymaking. It strikes me as there is a very strong link the other way around as well. There was a strong, as far as I understand, was a strong support for Jewish refugees, for example, during the Cold War. And that while Jewish refugees needed the support they could get, there was a strong political impetus for it, driven by the Cold War. Right now, political winds are blowing the other way. So the refugees, the support for accepting refugees, particularly non-white refugees, particularly non-Christian refugees, is going the other way as well. And all of this is within the same country that prides itself in the tradition of diversity and overcoming adversity and so on. How does it all come together? Is it that we need to start, do we need to start with actually figuring out what is the moral core of this society? Are we really that moral society, powerful, wonderful, that all people want to be part of? Or is it in more humility and understanding how this society was built, how this country was built, the challenges, why there are so many refugees are existing in the world, and our role in that as well. And maybe that would build a more consistent support for refugees rather than narrative, we're good and charitable. What do you think about that?
Can I answer that one? That is such a great question. And I believe that many of the decisions that are being made currently that are closing doors on a greater diversity of refugees and immigrants are based on fear. And Scripture says that perfect love casts out fear. So, you know, when you talk about humility, I think you're right on point. Love God, love your neighbor. I mean, honestly, it seems so simple, but it's so key in order for the gentleman that's running for office. I mean, if that is our filter moving forward as human beings, is love rather than fear, the decisions are going to be drastically different and are going to produce contributions rather than us actually missing out on the beauty of having a diversity of neighbors that we can all learn from and be a part of a greater community. So I think that's really where the sticking point has become in our country, in particular, is that moving forward because of fear rather than because of a generous spirit.
Let me add just one thing quickly to that. I appreciate the question. It strikes me that when Rabbi, when you were talking about the founding fathers, they were operating out of a very strong and deep Judeo-Christian moral consensus at the time. We don't have that anymore. And in fact, in my view, we are what my friend Oz Guinness calls more of a cut flower culture today, where we're still trying to live off of those Judeo-Christian moral mandates, but without the religious underpinnings that were, I think, so widely held when the country was founded. And that's why I think this panel is so important, and why the religious voice in this is so important, because I'm not optimistic about a strictly secular morality being able to carry the day and provide the kind of moral mandates that come from the various religious traditions when they're united together over the same things. So I think we seem to be aware that we're operating in a really different context culturally, and establishing a moral core for this incredibly pluralistic country today. Even though I think we do have a lot in common morally, but establishing a moral core, I think, that's a tricky business today, and much more challenging than it was when the country was founded.
A question just occurred to me. It does seem to me like fear is the problem, and I was wondering, it seems like a fear of oh, you're gonna come and take it away from me. This is my stuff, And I was wondering how much the religious point of view could make it clear to people what an abundance we have and how blessed we are. Is that possible?
Can I?
Please.
Well, we've seen it in our society that people are jealous, and they're thinking of refugees will come and take their jobs, they're going to take their status, they're going to take their homes, and they're going to take everything from them. They don't understand they can add to the society, and everybody what you have it's for you to keep. And it's okay if we add more resources, more intelligent people. It's okay. We have a huge land, and each and every one of us can have a share of it. But sometimes the selfishness plays a big role. And they don't know that, to be honest with you, and we don't own anything on this earth. We come naked, we leave naked. Right?
Amen.
Right? And I would, also add that, within Judaism, within the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Bible, we know that there was this whole system of having a sabbatical year, and then finally, 7 times 7, and the 50th year, you would get a Jubilee year where all debt was forgiven, everybody returned to nakedness, as it were, and started over. A very nice biblical vision, but also a beautiful piece of poetry and metaphor and artwork that we can take around with us, as we look, when a new group of refugees come in, that's the beginning of their Jubilee cycle, right? That's when we need to sort of turn it over and begin, our sharing as well. It's not, as the professor was saying, it's not necessarily something that comes in, it comes naturally to us, and the framers had to work very, very hard at making that part of who we are, because, you give people their natural ways, and they will protect everything that they're. That's why within the Bible, once again, people are mandated to give away the corners of their fields for the poor. It's not, gee, that would be nice. It's not, gee, wouldn't that be kind? It's not about that. It's not about feeling good. It's not about making somebody else feel good. You have to do it. Because knowing human beings, if you don't do it, it won't get done. If you don't mandate it, it won't get done. And that's why it's mandated. That's why it's a commandment. And that has to be, again, built into our society so that we move beyond that fear and realize that we really don't have anything to be afraid of. As so many people were saying, there are so many reasons why we need to actually welcome the stranger. And it's better for us if we do.
I can add to that. In every religion, we have obligations of charity to give. Like in the Muslim community, we have the zakat. Every year, we have to do our checks and balances and see how much we earned, and we have to pay it back to charity, and we have to help the needy. And we're obligated to do that. And God asked in each and every religion for charity, because they know sometimes people, they turn on the other side, but they're obligated to humanity.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, probably.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to know how everybody feel about the Trump administration and how it's had an effect on the children, especially like last year, and it's a zero tolerance policy that it had, and it affected 2,600 children last year. How do you feel about that? And as far as the faith-based organizations that it affected as well.
I spoke to Stephen Miller about this, not directly, but through a sermon. And here's what I told him. I told him that, and here's part of the message that he didn't get. Within my tradition, we're not supposed to sacrifice or seethe a calf in its mother's milk, or a kid in its mother's milk, right? That's why we don't eat cheeseburgers. But the other part of that is that if it was considered so cruel to the mother-child relationship to do that to an animal, how much the more so to a human being, right? We were mandated everybody was sacrificing animals at that time. We were told we can't sacrifice the child and the parent on the same day. We were told that if you are getting eggs from a nest, you have to chase the mother bird away first, which is not an easy thing to do. Yeah, so this is all artwork. This is all spiritual artwork. This is not law the way we have it today. But it translates to saying these are moral. We were talking about moral mandates just a moment ago. These are the moral mandates that we need to have in our pocket that must prevent us from committing these abominations and ripping kids out of their parents' arms. It's just the texts, the tradition, the spiritual core of who I am as a Jew, and I think who we are as a nation, screams out against that.
I think we probably have time for one more. And so those who are still raising their hands, perhaps if you have questions afterwards, if these folks have nowhere to be, we can hang out and address those.
I'd just like to roll back to an answer that you gave like 2 questions ago about having a moral core. A moral core to the country and one that's agreed upon. I kind of want to push back against that and just question the value of that when, at the time when our country was founded, maybe that morality was applied in a way that created an egalitarian government, but one that also denied rights to many people. And then in modern times, there's a large evangelical population whose moral core that would guide the country would probably be disagreeable to many people and not align with, I assume, many of your moralities. So, is that something that continually develops until we're left with a Bible or a Quran or a Torah that's just the good parts? Or I wonder how that develops through time.
Yeah, that's a good question and a totally fair pushback. I'd want to make a distinction, though, between the biblical ideals and the way that they're practiced. And I'll be the first to admit that religious communities are far from perfect. And there have been, I think, the rabbis pointed out, I think, some of the glaring inconsistencies in the application that it took, almost 100 years from the fact that, all men are created equal to getting slavery abolished. It still really puzzles me as to why that took so long. It's just a massive failure of moral imagination. But just because religious communities are far from perfect, I don't think that necessarily undermines the moral ideals, nor does it undermine the power of those ideals to motivate people to do the kinds of charitable things that, in my view, make the world go round. Religious people are by far the most generous people in the country today. Their giving far outstrips non-religious people. The amount of humanitarian charity that's done around the world by religious people far outstrips any other communities. Now, I don't say that to blow our own horn, but it's evidence, I think, of religious people living out their convictions consistently, even though there are communities and individuals who, we don't live it out consistently. I think the Bible makes allowance for that when it recognizes that we're all sort of created out of the crooked timber of humanity, and we all fall short, which is why in Christianity is why we need a savior. It's because our ability to erase that mountain of moral debt that we've accumulated over our lives, can only be done by the stroke of a savior's pen. So, if you want to follow up a little bit more on that, I'd be happy to do that afterwards.
Okay. For those of you who still have questions, again, perhaps in a moment here, I just want us to be able to wrap up by 8:30. So I want to ask each of you basically a final question to each of you that will give you a chance to maybe put some of your final thoughts in that. And it's basically this. I guess, what do each of you think the role of faith communities ought to be in this conversation moving forward, particularly at a time when refugee resettlement is, whether the phrase is under attack, at the very least, it's rapidly changing in this country. What role would you like to see, would you hope to see faith communities play in this conversation as a moral voice and otherwise moving forward? We'll just go down the line, starting with Abba.
For one thing, I would love to see more religious communities actually having this conversation on Sundays. I think that as
Saturdays or Fridays.
In my context, it's Sunday, Saturday, Friday. But just to as the professor was saying, I mean, if you cut out all the scripture that talks about welcoming the stranger and caring for the most vulnerable, almost the entire Bible is gone. So why aren't we talking more about it in our when we meet? And I think that's where it should start. And then the next step, of course, is then talking to our legislators.
I guess I'll start by quoting Elie Wiesel, who was the great chronicler of the Holocaust experience. And he said, the purpose of Jews is not to make the world Jewish, it's to make the world better. And I really think that that's really, what all our religions want to do. We want to make the world better. And we have this amazing tool at our disposal, which is this incredible democracy in which we live, where you can have various opinions, and they should all be cherished, and they should, what a great example of that we had all day today, on the TV and the radio. It was amazing. But I really do think that, that ultimately we have an opportunity, that the reason that there is a separation between church and state in this country, and you can check it with all your history books about the founders, is because they wanted the religious community to have a voice. They just didn't want that voice to become the voice of the nation, right? But we do have an obligation to keep pushing our moral perspective and our value perspective into the common arena so that we can all use it.
I think we all share the common goal, all of us together, and we should put our differences aside and work on the common goal of humanity, so we can be able to work together better. And if we think about our each and every one of us, about the color of our blood, it's one, and we should not put the colors of the skin to make a difference between us, and we need all to work together. I think everyone can be vulnerable when it comes to God, and people respect the word of God and follow what he asks us for. I think we're going to be in trouble with him. We're not, a lot of us, we're not following, and we need to come together to really work on the positive of our religions, because we all have a great religions.
That's way too convicting, so we need to move off of that point. I'd like to see that this issue of immigration and refugees be something that unites us instead of divides us. That'd be my hope, that we could learn better how to get along with each other despite deeply held and passionately held differences, even on the details of this. That we don't have to engage in the kind of character assassination and the kind of name calling and caricaturing of each other's positions, just to make a point. And in fact, I think that's, with the polarization in our culture today, I think how we're going to get along with each other despite deep differences about lots of things is, I think, one of the most pressing issues we have to deal with today.
Certainly. That is all the time we have for tonight's discussion. So I want to thank each and every one of you guys for coming out tonight and taking time out of your busy schedule to be part of this conversation and to contribute to it. I appreciated all the great questions that came from the audience. I should have just let you guys do it from the jump. But please join me in a round of applause for our panelists here for talking to us. I want to thank KPCC and the Luce Foundation for helping put this together. As I mentioned, I'll convince these guys to stick around for a little bit, so if anybody wants to come up and ask any further questions, please do. Also, I'm a religion reporter. If you have any story ideas, email me. And that's it. Thank you, guys. Have a great night.